And for our final session of the day, the power of youth in action, please join me in welcoming to the stage Helen Watts, Executive Director of Student Energy; Muku Madzivire, student at Columbia University and Zayed Sustainability Prize Youth Ambassador; Latefa Mansoori, Chairperson of Dhafra Youth Council and future sustainability leader; Archana Soreng, former member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change; and Isabella Sutton, student at Instituto Iberia and Zayed Sustainability Prize Youth Ambassador.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here. And of course, thank you to my wonderful panelists for joining me today as well. So my name is Helen Watts. I'm the Executive Director at Student Energy. And a lot of my work centers around working with young people and really getting to firsthand experience the incredible innovation and creative mindsets that young people bring to the most complex challenges we're facing today, whether it's sustainable development, the climate crisis, human rights and justice. And I'm still feeling so inspired by the award ceremony that we had this week, and being able to really see all of the incredible innovations and projects that are happening in local communities around the world. And I find seeing those projects, especially when so many of them are led by young people, it really reaffirms my commitment, and I think many of our commitment, to the work that we're doing on this issue. It gives us hope, because the people who really will be leading this charge, really leading this way 10, 20, 30 years from now, are not necessarily the leaders that you see on panels day in and day out. They're young people, they're young leaders. We know that there are 1.2 billion young people under the age of 24 around the world. That number goes up to over 2 billion once we account for young people up to the age of 30. That's a quarter of our world's population. And imagine what would happen and what would change if we were to empower every single one of those young people to care about the planet, to care about people, but more so feel like they have the confidence and tools to make change happen while they're still young. With that, I am so excited to be moderating this discussion with some of these incredible leaders who are really leading the way on their own issues in very different ways. And I think it's important that we really see all of the multifaceted approaches that young people take to making change happen, whether it's at a policy level, whether it's in community, whether it's through education. So we'll just dive right in, because I want to give as much time as possible for our panel here to share their wisdom and their experiences. And I think we'll start with Latefa. And I'll maybe invite everybody to just do a really quick kind of introduction of your work before you dive into the question. But my question for you, Latefa, we all agree that engaging young people in decision-making improves and scales policies related to sustainable development, human rights, peace and security. So what's holding us back? What are the attitudes, the systems, the barriers in place that are keeping us from including young people more actively in this space?
Thank you, Helen, for your question, and I would like to extend my thanks to Zayed Sustainability Prize team for inviting us here today. So just to give a bit of background, I have worked in the youth space, especially in climate-related fields for the past, let's say, 3 to 4 years. I honorably represented the UAE at COP28 as one of the 10 UAE Youth Climate Delegates. So I've been around the space, I've seen multiple perspectives of youth from across the globe, and I actually realized that our problems in the UAE are nothing in comparison to youth globally. Alhamdulillah, we're very blessed to be in a country that is very supportive. So for me to say that there are challenges, I can speak of them from a perspective of someone else across the globe, but not as an Emirati. So if I would say that there are systems already in place supporting youth empowerment, supporting youth technically from a knowledge background, funding them from a startup perspective as well, that are already in place and already available. So one example I would say, it's actually it's a short story. So back when I was at Bonn, the United Nations Climate Change Framework Conference, so we were having lunch with different youth from across the world. We were talking about how are they here. They were all discussing how very difficult was for them to get this chair to be there in an international conference with a bunch of leaders, a bunch of decision makers, and people who have been in the space for more than 10 years of a minimum. And I said I was here representing the UAE as a youth climate delegate because we're trying to institutionalize the youth champion role in the COP history and within the system of COP itself. And then we started talking about youth councils. So youth councils is a model that is followed in the UAE, where let's say every emirate have a youth council that represents the youth population of its area. And we do have also youth councils in governments and in private sector. So every government would have their 10 individual youth council who will be connecting leadership with youth as well. Another thing is that we do have youth and board committees of big organizations in the UAE. So to me, saying that there is a huge challenge in the system, this is honestly something I cannot say because we're blessed to not see it. But from a global perspective, such models are very important to be followed. And with the institutionalization of the youth champion, the UAE had its footprint in the COP28 system to have that continue. And we've seen that in Azerbaijan recently as well. They've appointed their youth champion to proceed on this roadmap as well.
Thank you so much, Latefa. I think those are some really important points to kind of see how can I build from what I'm seeing in my own experience or my community and really use that as a way to hopefully maybe de-risk the idea of other countries or other institutions doing a similar approach where you're inviting young people to sit on your boards, you're creating youth councils. I know Kenya does a similar approach where there's a bit of a youth advisory model as well, advising government. Canada has that as well, but there's so much more to be done to actually get young people into the room. And you made an important point about access as well and how in that space at COP, you were really hearing from young people around the table how hard they had to fight to have that seat and to really be there in the room. Maybe we'll shift over to Archana. So Archana, you were a member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, which is still a fairly recent initiative. We've had, I think, 2 cohorts now of the Youth Advisory Group. And as a young woman from an Indigenous community, where we heard from Hindu this morning as well, Indigenous voices are so critical, but too often still underrepresented in this space. How did this experience of being in the Youth Advisory Group really shape your own role in the sustainability work that you do, and what opportunities and challenges have you been able to work on in that role, bringing kind of your identity and your experiences into that advisory group?
Next is Dan.
First of all, I'm very grateful to be here, and Johar everyone. My experience being part of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change has been very unique and emotional in itself, because I feel, I truly believe that it is because of the struggles of our ancestors and elders that we young people have been able to access those spaces, and I truly recognize and value that. And having said that, I feel one of the most important thing which I felt in that space is that the feeling of being seen and heard. And I think that is something which I feel that if there is intent, there can be more spaces where young people are seen and heard, and that is what the world should be, is something which I truly believe in. The other thing which I feel is that as a young Indigenous woman, it has been an important space also to feel space and talk about your culture, talk about your journey and your history. And I feel if we see in the global paradigm, it is only now that the role of indigenous people is recognized in terms of climate action. And I feel it's a little irony, because over the years and over the decades, we have seen indigenous peoples as backwards and as savage, and all of a sudden in this transition, we are coming back to them. And I feel indigenous people needs to be approached from a deep sense of love, respect, and solidarity, and that has to be a continued action which requires institutional changes in making their voices heard and making them part of decision-making spaces, which also brings me down of what issues have I seen and what how I see it and perceive it is like, I have seen that there are young people across the globe, my fellow allied groups who are non-indigenous have also demonstrated a strong sense of solidarity, and that is the strength I feel in young people. We all are here, that it is important for all of us young people to stand for each other, which I have felt, and I aim to create that. But at the same time, I also feel that there is a lack of resources being allocated for indigenous people and young people overall. And that is something which I would like to give a little data on that. We have already heard the number that out of the largest global climate philanthropy, which is like 2%, if we did a study in 2022, and we found that even out of that 2%, only 0.7% goes to young people in the global south. And it is very difficult that if there are lack of resources, then how will we be able to support young people in a better way? So I would like to pause here by saying that we need more youth leadership, welcoming them in a space which is safe and where they are heard, but also intentionally allocating more resources for young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Archana. That was such an important point. I love that you brought in that data point. Only 2% of global philanthropy goes to climate work, and less than 0.07 of that is actually going to climate justice focused work by young people in the global south. That number should really alarm us, and I think it's a very clear call to action that we can bring into our spaces wherever point we're coming into this space at. And really advocate for a reallocation of resources to youth-led and locally led initiatives. We're starting to hear that narrative kind of pick up a little bit more steam, I think, in the last couple of years, but we need to really throw our weight behind that message. So thank you so much for that. And Isabella, we'll turn over to you. So you've accomplished so much at such a young age, and you won with your high school the Zayed Sustainability Prize in 2022. Which is incredible. I think you'd mentioned that you think you might be one of the younger people at ZSP Forum as well, which we're so lucky to have you here speaking to us and sharing kind of your knowledge and your experience. And I think one question that I really want to know is what inspired you to first get involved in the sustainability space and really drive this initiative, the Create Your Future initiative? What was that spark for you? And if you could share one message with leaders about youth empowerment, what would that message be?
Yeah, so I'm very grateful for this opportunity that the prize has given me into being here. So I'm currently right now 17 years old, but what initially motivated me to get into this project was actually a school trip when I was around 14 or 15 years old, where we went to the south of the country, which is very known to have so much scarcity of products. So we went there and went to a public school to make donations, which after that, we make some other donations to a community of houses that was 100 feet away from each other. So that day we went and we gave the donation to the kids that were on school day. And the donations, the toys, the foods, they were so happy for us being there. And when the time came of going into the house communities, I went on the first door and I knocked. And I saw the woman, the mother, and the kids weren't at school. So I doubted myself. That's so weird. That's a school 100 feet away. Why aren't they there? And then I left it there. I went to the second house, the same, the third, the fourth. After I got into the sixth house, where a 14, almost 15-year-old girl, it's always curious, I went and asked, hey, why aren't your kids at school? There's a school 100 feet away. It's free. And the mother responded to me, I can't even afford them clothes and food. How can I be able to afford them other stuff for them to go to school? And that just broke me. In that moment, I knew that there needed to be a change. So I came back after that trip, and I was like, no, something has to be done. So I initially did it by myself with my family because I wanted to do it. I remember the mother name was Sonia and the little girl, her name was Lucia. So like around 2 weeks later, I went and gave some school kits, which contained pencil cases, book bags, notebooks, everything they needed to go to school. And the next time I met Lucia, it wasn't at her home anymore. She was at school. So that experience made me see that I didn't just change the future of a little girl, but I also changed the potential girl that this little girl could have. So that very inspired me. So if there's a key message that I could give to all world leaders, is that to invest in the youth. They have so many great visions that they can give to us. There's so many things to give them the sources, the platforms. Youth, young people, usually they have so many fresh ideas that we haven't heard before. They have so many boundless energy, of course, but most importantly, they have the urgency that they want to take action. And I think that's one of the most important things that we're missing right now, the ability of wanting to take action. So by empowering this youth, it's a very great opportunity to accelerate the changes that we can have into making a better future for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabella. No, it's a really powerful message. I think both in terms of the way that those experiential moments when you're connecting with people, when you're connecting with other communities, how those can really shape your passions and what you see as the most important issue for you to be putting your energy into. But then that twinned message on where can you put that energy if the resources and the platforms aren't available? And I do see from the work that we do and even being in this space, there is so much passion that young people have for climate justice and all of its intersecting issues, whether it's access to education, whether it's human rights. But those resources, those platforms need to be available and need to be scaled, most importantly. We can't necessarily kind of look at this panel here even and think like, oh, it's happening, it's all happening. There's enough support for young people because we represent such a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of the larger number of young people. So I think that's a really, really powerful message. And Muku, over to you. You've had a really interesting role where you were the former president of Zimbabwe's junior parliament. Possibly the former president of Zimbabwe one day, we'll see. So youth representation, we know, is so critical to build the foundations and policies to shape sustainable development. And we're really the only ones, as I'd mentioned, who can carry this work 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future by starting now. What insights and learnings did you take away from that role as the president of the junior parliament on the impact that youth interests really have on high-level policymaking and decision-making?
Thank you so much for that question. It's a pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to be on this panel with these phenomenal people. So very quickly, just as an introduction, because I know the concept of a junior parliament is a bit unfamiliar to people. The idea behind the Zimbabwe Junior Parliament is very similar to, I think, what Latefa described as youth councils, what's been referred to elsewhere as junior councils in Kenya, like you said, in Canada, and so on. What's unique about the Zimbabwe Junior Parliament, though, is that it is an elected body that seeks to mirror the senior parliament. So high school students would elect a junior parliamentarian, a junior member of parliament. They would elect a junior senator, and so on, all the way to an election of the president of the junior parliament. And the idea was to set up this leadership development initiative that would doubly function as almost a consultancy for the government that's focused exclusively on the interests of children and young people. And I think there were three specific impacts that we identified over the course of our term. I was initially meant to serve a one-year term, but unfortunately this coincided with COVID-19, so I ended up having to serve a second term. But I think the first and perhaps the most obvious is simply the representation of youth interests. I think it goes without saying that the number one way to represent the interests of a particular community is to place that community at the table, to invite them into the discussion, to ask what their thoughts are, and so on. One of the most moving instances of this for me was with respect to the lockdowns under COVID-19. Something we discovered in our research with children was that as a side consequence of the lockdowns, many children in abusive households and abusive families had ended up locked up with the people who were abusing them in such a way that schools, which were initially their safe spaces where they would be able to find at least some recourse to these challenges that they were facing, were no longer available to them. And so it's challenges like these where in many cases it's not possible for children to stand up and approach adults to talk about these challenges that they're facing. It's often much easier for them to bring up these challenges and these situations to people of their age group, so to their peers. But I think the second and probably more interesting consequence of this representation was something that's very often understated, which is that representation compounds. The more I see young people in positions of power and influence, the more I see young people in parliament, in the government, and so on, the more likely it is that I myself will say, perhaps I have a chance of being there as well. For me, this looked like, I think in my first few weeks in office, I think 12-year-old approached me and said, this is so exciting, I want to be just like you. And I didn't really realize what this meant until about 3 or 4 years later when I saw the person on national television and they were now in the junior parliament. So it's things like that where merely seeing people of your age group being able to stand up in these conversations, to sit at the table, that are so instrumental to really widening the scope of this commitment to the destigmatization of young people, which I think is ultimately what the goal of youth representation should be. Because very often youthfulness is stigmatized. We're afraid of what young people bring to the table. We're afraid of the innovation that they're bringing, the way they challenge the norm, the way they really turn over the tables and ask us to rethink everything that we had told ourselves was true. So it's really important that in thinking about youth representation, we're thinking about it in terms of really this compounding effect, but also the unique value proposition of youthfulness and how it impacts the many spaces that we occupy and the many aspirations that we have.
Yeah, I love that. Representation compounds. It is such a powerful thing to hear from young people who are starting in this space about all of the young people they've seen who've inspired them to get into that space. And really, like, that message is so consistent. I wouldn't have necessarily seen myself doing this if I didn't see this other person doing this. That's why youth-to-youth mentorship is such a beautiful thing as well. I don't think we do youth-to-youth mentorship enough, but the way that young people can inspire each other is really powerful. So thank you for that, Muku. And maybe back to you, Latefa. We had a panel just a couple of panels ago focusing on the link between economic development and sustainable development. And we know that entrepreneurship and strategic foresight need to be considered in low and zero carbon economic roadmaps. How can youth shape these economies, especially in developing countries? But maybe, speak to kind of any particular context that might resonate with your work and experience as well.
Hello? Okay. Yeah. So, honestly, there's a very fine line between ensuring economical development and ensuring sustainability. And I think today's generation is very aware of that, and we're really working hard to merge these together. So from an occupational background, I do work in industry and I do work in environment, especially in that field. It is very important to have an environmentalist in each and every engineer, in each and every scientist. You really need to have this, even if it's a shallow background, because it's a knowledge that is learned with experience. And that's from, like, if you're studying, if you're working, try to incorporate sustainability, come to conversations such as the ones we're having today to ensure and to think how you can embed that, whether it's in developing countries or in whichever context, actually. But from a developing country's perspective, I think it is really important to promote sustainability. So one of the girls here also mentioned her experience in her country and how she ensured education is continued. So this is really important because education would open huge doors for you. Education can give you opportunities of scholarships, of many different things that would make you dive deep into this field. Also ensuring that you come up with ideas to solve the solution from the root, which is something we're all at this stage, because all what we're witnessing today might be from, let's say, the Industrial Revolution a couple of years back. There was no environmental issues long ago, and now the youth today, our generation, is facing these consequences, and we're at a stage where we need to solve them, and we need to make sure that they don't happen in the future for the coming generation. One point as well that is really important is supporting youth startups.
Yeah.
Youth startups, as you mentioned, youth think in a different way, not as like the people who have been in the industry for 10 years or more. So I think the older generation need to be open about these ideas, about hearing youth, not only hearing them to listen to them, but actually hearing them and understanding where are these ideas coming from and how can they be transformed into tangible opportunities that can impact the future of us all.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's an expression that's used quite a bit of seeing young people as partners, not just as beneficiaries. Really just seeing the potential of young people, not as like a group that we just need to kind of help and lift up, which we do, but also like the real impact potential that they carry. I've seen young people go off to start initiatives, companies that, you know, are bringing massive amounts of solar energy to communities that have been previously either disconnected or relying on diesel power. Like there's so much that young people are tangibly doing in a way that is very measurable and is very much, is very much in line with the goals that we're ultimately trying to reach. But I want to pick up on one piece that you said there, Latefa, around access to education. And Isabella, I'll turn back to you for this one because you have such a depth of experience in working on school-based initiatives, and that's really your thing. And I would love to hear from you. You'd spoken a little bit about this importance of access to education. But I would love to hear your perspective on the connection between access to education and sustainability. How does increased access to education from your experience really support young people in, why is it so important so as kind of a mechanism to get more young people into sustainability, to get them thinking about sustainability?
Yeah, sure. I think that I always have this saying of the world is a closed book without the ability to read. So without an education, without that, there's no assistant that people can have. So education makes a pivotal role when coming into how people can acquire a set of skills, learning knowledge, and all of that. And I've seen it firsthand how important it is to teach kids about all this complex situation and issues that we're now facing, like climate change, sustainability, inequality. All of these things are so important right now in the world. And not only teaching them the academic, this set of skills, but also teaching them the responsibility, discipline, and resilience that comes with it. That everyone says the future, the present, but right now the youth is the present and the future to come. So for them to be responsible and aware of what it is to come, about what's happening, the problems around us, it's so important. Education will provide them with all the set of skills, with everything they need to know, so that when they go out there and they're ready for it, and they already can be, the future leaders of this world, and they can feel sustainable, and they can find their ways, And it's so important for all of us in the youth to understand that we're not just doing for what it is for today, but we're learning how to make a better world for tomorrow, and for what it is to come into changing our, current issues. And I think that's so important to make a more sustainable world.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's that power for young people to really feel like they have what it takes to design a better future, especially when we're feeling the impacts so deeply right now of the climate crisis. And maybe over to you, Archana. So related, but slightly different kind of line of thought here. I would love to hear your thoughts on the Declaration for Future Generations that came out fairly recently as well. And what are some of the, maybe you could kind of introduce what the Declaration for Future Generations is, and what are some of the actionable ways that multilateral agencies and countries can actually implement some of the envisioned changes to include youth in policymaking?
I think it's one of a very landmark to have the future generations declarations. I think one thing which I feel why it stands landmark at this point of juncture in the transition of and the conversation around sustainability is because it talks about the young people not only who are now but also of the future generation. And I think it's extremely important because it is a call to action for all the countries and different stakeholders. And I feel there is a sense of accountability here where and shared responsibility where how we all can come together committing for a better future for everybody, and not only for us who are living right now but also will be inheriting the world. At the same time, I also feel that what I truly appreciate is it has also emphasized about indigenous people's contribution and their need to be part of the decision-making spaces in the climate discourse. I think it is extremely important also to understand that often when we are talking about implementations, young people are mostly reached out to implement, but not in the curation and the ideation process, which I feel is extremely important. And that's why I want to emphasize that young people and indigenous people should be leaders of climate actions and not victims of climate policies.
Thank you so much, Archana. That's a really powerful message to leave this room with as well. And maybe for our last question, individual question, then we'll do one very quick wrap up for everybody. Muku, young people, we know young people care deeply about climate justice. And as we're striving to make headway on this issue, what are some ways that we can encourage youth to develop leadership capacities, find like-minded individuals, develop peer networks and communities to create more impactful change towards climate justice?
Absolutely. I think, unfortunately or fortunately, at all levels, young people and everyone beyond, there is an urgent need, especially when it comes to climate action, to decouple ourselves from this tendency to postpone youth involvement. To say young people are just the future, they can wait. We will hear what they have to say 10 years from now, 15 years from now, and so on. Because unfortunately, the state of the world is just not conducive to that kind of future planning anymore. A report came out just a few days ago that 2024 was the hottest year on record, and the first time that the Earth exceeded the 1.5 degree mark in comparison to pre-industrial levels. There is no time to postpone youth involvement. But I think more importantly, the biggest challenge with this postponement is that it excuses young people taking the back seat. When young people are persistently told, young people are the future, we'll hear from you in the future, there's no reason for us to want to take the front seat. I think it's so important that at every level we're reminding young people that now is your time and now is your moment to really take the front seat, to take on the wheel and to become in charge of the many movements across the world that are working to repair our Earth from this triple crisis that we're facing that threatens really to upend life as we know it.
Yeah, that's, I think, really critical for us to keep in mind that change, I think this panel is called Voices of Tomorrow as well, but it's really about the voices of today. Like, how can we're at a tipping point, but we know that every degree matters. How can we really catalyze action now to get ourselves back on track? I think we're at time, but I'm going to give our panel just one word to summarize what your priority is for, let's do the next 2 years, because we don't think in 5, 10-year timelines, we're thinking, what can we do now? Your word that really summarizes your priority to really move the needle on this issue. And maybe we'll start with you, Latefa. Or we can start. unless that works?
Yeah, it's
oh,
working.
perfect.
So one priority is ensuring access to education and investing youth energy in the right path and in the right direction, as well as ensuring there are financial funds for those creative people among youth.
Thank you, Latefa. Archana.
For me, it's one is building solidarity. I truly believe and hold really close to my heart of solidarity because I think that is something which I have experienced making difference, and working more in finding more allyship and working on more resource allocation for young people, and that is, as it was shared earlier in the sessions, is having direct access to indigenous people and young people beyond, which is like, if you say, how do we make finance accessible to the young people and indigenous people? Thank you.
Thank you, Archana. Isabella.
Yeah, I think I agree with Latefa and what she said, that the access to education, because we need to give more opportunities to everyone to educate themselves and to have more ideas and gain more knowledge, but it's also mostly breaking the cycle into what it means of trying to leave things for tomorrow and saying, oh, someone else is going to do it for us. Someone else is going to help. It has to be in one as a leader and as a person to find themselves and say, let's move on, let's make a change. So it's better to be the leader who breaks the cycle, be the leader who makes the change and go help, and be the leader that it's different.
Thanks, Isabella. And Muku.
For me, it's just, like I said earlier on, representation compounds. Now more than ever before, it's important to put young people in the front seat, put them at the forefront of the movements for climate justice, for climate action, for sustainable development that will define not only our future, but truly are defining our now.
Amazing. Well, you heard it here first. Let's give a massive thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you so much. Hopefully you're leaving the session feeling as inspired as I am, and lots more conversations to come. So some great call to actions to take away. Thank you all so much for being here as well.